readings from Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. Jesus restores a demon-possessed man. They, that's Jesus and the disciples, went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he'd often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus has said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off, reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who'd been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who'd seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who'd been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus didn't let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Helen, can I have the picture up on the screen, please? And I'll ask you to take it off in due course. But in order to start us off this morning, in terms of the passage that Dave read out so well, I thought I would come at it at a slightly different angle. This is a picture from a book I've got in my office called The Scroll, okay? Written by a guy called Nick Page. And the scroll is, well, it's various passages from the Bible, all set in a tabloid style, okay? And so the idea is that if the Sun or the Mirror or any other tabloid newspaper you care to mention was around at the time of Jesus, how would they report what was happening? And so this page that you can see on the screen is the page all to do with the Bible passage that Dave just read out. And it reads, "Jesus pigs out, demon-infected swine do lemming impression." Okay? And by the side of it, there is an article, which is very tongue-in-cheek, okay? But I suppose it brings the passage to life a little bit more. And so the article reads, Jesus of Nazareth cast a demon out of a man today and made the demons go into a herd of pigs. The pigs subsequently threw themselves into the lake and drowned. I'm livid, said the owner of the pigs. 1 minute they were snuffling about and doing normal piggy things. The next thing they're completely barking and trying to do the breaststroke. It was mass porkicide. Now, the owner intends to sue, and the people of the town have asked Jesus to leave. I had a big order ready to go to make up Big Abdul's pig in a bun special, he said. Very popular with the Roman soldiers they are. It was obviously a miracle, said the town's mayor, and granted that this man had been so violent that it was impossible for people to even walk by him. But you have to ask yourself, what next? Rabid chickens? Daffy ducks? Cows jumping over the moon? We can't afford for this bloke to go around the countryside using our livestock as dustbins for unwanted demons. But even the mayor, however, had to admit that he was impressed with the miracle. Obviously, I'm pleased for this bloke, he said, and I have to admit it made a great spectacle. I particularly enjoyed the pig that did the triple somersault with a tucked pike. Several people watching gave him a perfect 6. Thanks, Alan. You can take that picture off now. And it is, in terms of that passage, it is very easy to concentrate on the more, shall we say, salacious and incredulous aspects of the passage. It is, after all, Mark's largest exorcism passage, and one in which there are all sorts of different aspects that you can highlight. For the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight 3 aspects of the passage, but there are more. You know, I could talk about demon possession and the term legion and what that means, but I'm not going to do that. I could talk about Jesus engaging with the demon and what that signifies, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go back to my favourite way of looking at any passage, and that is by placing ourselves into it. But you might well say, well, we live in the West. We live in, 21st century Norfolk. It's very difficult for us to place ourselves into demon possession. Some Christians would argue that there is no such thing as demon possession, that actually what this story is all about is a story of a very mentally ill man, and the readers and the people who lived around the time of Jesus didn't understand about such things, and therefore Legion is just he's just a paranoid schizophrenic. And whilst that might be true, but to suggest that demon possession doesn't take place, I think is narrowing our minds somewhat. Who knows what happens in terms of spiritual realms? But I do find it interesting to note that even in such a secular establishment as the NHS does recognise that when healing takes place, it's all the better if mind, body and spirit are healed. Because the NHS would not pay for people like me as chaplains if that was not the case. But anyway, I digress, because we're not looking at that. Instead, we're placing ourselves into the story. And the first way we're going to do that is we're just going to have a look at the geography of the story. Mark, you see, doesn't often use geography in his passages. So it's always interesting when he does. So we'll look at that. But also, in terms of placing ourselves within the story, we'll sort of finish off with having a look at the reaction of two sets of people, or a group of people and an individual. For after Legion is cast into the pigs, and the pigs then commit porkicide, we have two distinct and very different reactions. We have the reactions of the people in the local town, who essentially tell Jesus to buzz off, and then we have the reaction of the now sane man who wants to follow Jesus and get into the boat with Jesus. And the rest of the disciples and Jesus say no. And of course, I will ask you, who are you in the story? Who do you most relate to? But before we that, let's have a look at geography and see what that teaches us. For as I said, Mark doesn't do geography very often. So when he does, we need to sit up and take notice. And the reason I talk about geography is because chapters 4 and 5 of Mark, that June has been concentrating on, and no doubt will come back to when she's back, they revolve around the Lake Galilee. Chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel begins with Jesus standing on a boat on the Lake Galilee, and talking about the parable of the sower. He then does some further teaching about lamps and seeds. And then June, when she last preached on Mark's Gospel, she spoke about Jesus calming the storm on the lake. And this Sunday, Jesus gets to the other side of the lake. That's how the passage begins. Jesus gets in his boat and he goes to the other side of the lake. Now, you would think that all the land that surrounds the Lake Galilee is Israel, wouldn't you? Well, I thought it was anyway. But actually, it isn't. Currently, the east side of the lake, so today the banks of the lake rise up steeply up to the Golan Heights. You might have heard of such a place. Have you heard of the Golan Heights? It's an area of Syria that's still disputed today. And if you go to that part of Israel, you can still see the burnt out wrecks of tanks along the border between Israel and Syria. And the east part of the lake, where Jesus lands, is still a bit of a bargaining counter and a long drawn out peace process between Israel and surrounding lands. Even longer than what is happening between Israel and the Gaza Strip at the moment, which is in the south of Israel. And it was just as complicated back in Jesus' time as well. I won't go into the full details because we'll be here forever. But basically, ever since Jesus' time, and even before that, the eastern part of Lake Galilee has never been part of the state of Israel. It just hasn't. Why am I telling you this? Well, because I think it's important to realize that this area isn't a Jewish area. These aren't Jews that Jesus speaks to. And that's borne out by the fact that there were a herd of pigs nearby. No Jewish person kept pigs. They were unclean. And talking of being unclean, note where Jesus is when he lands in the middle of the night on a foreign shore. He's surrounded by tombs. Again, another unclean place where dead people were dressed and resided. And again, no Jew would be seen in such a place. The passage itself, Mark's passage, doesn't make it clear why Jesus went to such a place. But I just want to ask the passage the question, is it just a prediction, a prophecy of what is to come? Because the Jews expected the Messiah to push out the Romans, to take them back to where they came from. The Romans were also seen as unclean, eating pigs and worshipping lots of gods, not the one true God. And so when Legion, Yes, the word comes from the Roman for between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers. The mass of demons inside this poor man's body gets pushed out into a group of pigs who then subsequently commit, yes, porkicide and dive into the sea. Is Mark looking at the bigger picture here? For don't forget that Mark, as he goes through the gospel, always wants us to look at the bigger picture, at the climax of his story, of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. For at the climax of Mark's story, Jesus himself will end up naked, like the man, isolated, like Legion, outside the tomb, the town, among the tombs, like Legion, controlled by the Romans, shouting seemingly incomprehensible things, just as the poor man who had Legion inside him did those things. But just like the cross, just as Jesus is dealing with the supernatural, with the spiritual forces at work here, and whilst we must never forget the bigger picture, Jesus is also concerned with the individual as well. Just like the cross, where despite being in the midst of death throes, Jesus manages to have a conversation with two thieves, as well as making sure that his mum is taken care of. In this passage, we must not forget about the person who had the demons within him. Jesus doesn't. And perhaps the only reason why Jesus went across the lake to meet this man was to heal that man. And so what I would say is that wherever humans are in need today, oh, that's everywhere, the gentle healing message of Jesus needs to be applied. And so Jesus identifies with those in pain to bring God's healing where it's needed most. All we have to do is respond. So Jesus cares for you. He cares for you. And he will, on occasion, come across a metaphorical lake just because he can. How brilliant is that? But whilst all of that might be true, we then have to recognize that some people will reject him and some people want to stay with him. And as I said earlier, that is borne out by the two responses we get within the passage. And I must admit, I find it odd, this particular passage. In particular, I find the locals' reaction really odd, because they must have known about this man who inhabited their tombs. They probably told their children warning stories about him. And don't get me wrong, I could understand how initially they were afraid, as it says in verse 15. When they see this man who had the strength to break chains, looking well, just sitting there and dressed, they would of course think to themselves, "Oh, what on earth is going on here? Is it some greater evil that has come?" And of course it's the middle of the night, and they might not have heard of Jesus, and they might not have never have clapped eyes on him before, so they would have been at best suspicious, and yes, more than likely afraid. But why, once it had been explained to them about the miracle that had happened, why did they plead for Jesus to leave? That makes no sense, does it? In a previous church, Helen and I knew a guy who's paranoid schizophrenic. And when he was on his medication and he was awake, because the medication made him sleep a lot, he's a lovely, lovely bloke, brilliant, a concerned Christian who would do anything for you. But I've seen him at some of his low points, not when he's been dangerous, because he has been, but after those points, when he's been into hospital and then felt tremendous guilt about some of the stuff that he had thought about and occasionally done. And I don't know whether it's still the case because we haven't seen him for a while, but back when we knew him, he would have loved to be healed. And the people who care and love this guy we know would have loved for him to be healed and would celebrate with him if he was healed. And so to me at least, it makes no sense. It makes no sense that the people of the town would reject the person who has performed this miracle. Why? Why would you do such a thing? Well, perhaps although these people, these local town people were, Syrian or Persian, perhaps there was just a hint of Britishness about their attitude as well. For perhaps these people just didn't want to be disturbed. They didn't want to change. They knew that the man had been healed, but they were used to him not being well. They were used to him acting in a particular manner, and they therefore got to change their viewpoint of him. He had changed, but they didn't want to accept that change. Perhaps also they wanted Jesus to leave because they were more concerned with material things than humanity itself. Note that the pigs charging into the sea are mentioned when it comes to summing up what had happened. Were they upset because their livestock was killed? Were they more upset about that than the one human who was now healed? I often tell this story, but in the original Gulf War in the early 1990s, John Simpson, the BBC News correspondent, was reporting live from Kuwait City. And he was reporting the fact that he could see cruise missiles fired by the Americans, and he could see these cruise missiles literally turning at street junctions on the way to their target. And as he spoke, the cameras turned round, and you saw the cruise missiles do precisely that, turn. And then you heard an explosion, and you saw a cloud of dust and some screaming. And that evening, the major complaint from no end of British viewers was not the fact that we could hear screaming or saw the bombs, or later on in the same report, with a fair bit of warning, we saw some dead bodies. No, the major complaint was the fact that in his haste to get the story and talk live on TV, John Simpson, BBC correspondent in 40-degree heat, was not wearing a tie. It is amazing sometimes how we fixate on the small, on the actual insignificant, rather than either the bigger picture or indeed the human being at the centre of a story. But perhaps even more than that, perhaps the people from the town did not want Jesus to stay around because it disturbed their idea of who God was, their idea of religion. In other words, they had a fixed idea as to who God was, and God certainly didn't do anything supernatural, and didn't do anything like that, and certainly didn't help people, and certainly didn't help people away from the temple. And I think there is an element within English Christian tradition that says, you know what, on Sundays I come to church and I expect to hear certain things, and I expect to meet my idea of who God is, and I want to hear that. What I don't want to hear about is this, this and this. I have my idea of who God is, and he's in my little box, and woe betide anyone who challenges that idea of who God is and who Jesus is. And we don't even mention God's Spirit because that's a bit weird. And we certainly don't mention helping people who I don't like. And we stick to Sundays because that's what you do. Perhaps I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but perhaps I'm not as well. But then finally, in terms of reaction, we have the reaction of the man himself and his interaction with Jesus. And again, he does something quite natural. This man, this legion, he's been healed. He feels good about himself. And he sees the person who has healed him rejected. And he thinks to himself, well, if the person who has healed me is rejected, what are the townspeople going to make of me? They've not exactly helped me in the past. They've chained me up. They've ostracised me. No, I don't want to stay here. I want to go with this Jesus bloke who has done me some good. And so he tries to get into the boat with the disciples and with Jesus. And you don't blame him, really. And Jesus says, no, sorry. And instead says to him, go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And the reading then finishes with, so the man went away and began to tell in their 10 cities, the Decapolis, how much Jesus has done for him. And all the people were amazed. And just a couple of things to say about that. Firstly, Jesus telling the man to stay is in direct contrast with the calling of the first disciples, where he said to them, come follow me. And yet here he says, stay where you are. And so it must be said that sometimes Jesus says, stay. Stay where you are. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. But these people need you and they need to hear about me. At other times, though, Jesus will say, no, leave your family, your friends, your loved ones, and come and follow me. It's going to be exciting and dangerous. And there will be times when, to be honest, you haven't got a clue as to what's going on. But come anyway. And both the staying and the going are as equally valid. As a minister, people like me and June and others, we get told both. Sometimes we get told by God to stay, but at other times we get told to go. And what is right one year will not be right the next. And there are times when you hear of missionaries, or indeed ministers, or any other worker for God, and there is a view that they are somehow holier than everybody else because they've been told by God to go. But actually, the staying behind is just as valid. And more importantly, can sometimes be a bit harder. You know, let's face it. Who would you rather tell people about Jesus? Would you rather tell your unbelieving family and friends who know your faults and know you when you make mistakes? Or would you rather tell complete strangers about your relationship with Jesus? Both have their issues. But I think given a choice, I'd rather go for the stranger option. Because it's more than likely you're never going to see them again. And certainly in terms of chaplaincy, one of the great advantages of chaplaincy is that for that moment, in that intense moment, you are with that person. But the chances are you won't see them again. But secondly, and tying in with that in terms of those two verses that finish off our passage, I just want to concentrate on one word that's repeated in the last two verses of the passage that Dave read out. And that's the word tell. In verse 19, it says, Jesus told the man, go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. And then in verse 20, it says, so the man went away and began to tell in the 10 cities area how much Jesus had done for him. And I'm reliably informed by the books in my office that the word tell has two different meanings. The first tell refers to the man's family. It underscores the intimate, personal nature of the witness that the man was asked to bear. It's almost a conversation with a few close people where you tell someone about your day and they in turn tell you about their day. But the second meaning of tell, contained in verse 20, is though it's more of a proclamation, a sort of really preach in terms of a monologue, in effect what I'm doing now. And what I would say is both have their place. Both have a place not only for me, but for you as well. In terms of the first meaning, the personal, intimate nature indicates that listening is just as important as telling. Listening to someone else's story, listening to someone else's viewpoint, and yes, telling your story, but acknowledging that other person's views, their stories are just as valid. But also there are times when it's right to preach the gospel, to tell people about not your story, but the grand story, the grand narrative of Jesus, of God, of the Holy Spirit. And so in terms of tell, both of those have their place. Both of them are really hard, but both of them require different skill sets. So there you have it. The story of the man who was healed of demon possession and whose demons are so numerous that they were transferred to a load of pigs who subsequently did a lemming impression. And as I said at the beginning of the sermon, it's very easy to concentrate on the miraculous when looking at a passage such as this. But don't forget about the stuff around the edges. Don't forget that Mark forever wants us to point us towards the cross. Even in the geography of the lake, the place where those things happen, they can tell us a little bit about the culmination of Mark's gospel. But also don't forget that Jesus cares about the individual. So you here, as well as the grand picture. And then we have two options of people responding to Jesus. On the one hand, we have the town people who rejected Jesus because it might mean that their viewpoints, that their equilibrium is going to be disturbed. But on the other, we have the person who's been healed, been touched by Jesus, who wants to follow Jesus intimately. And then when he's told, he has to stay. And he makes sure that he tells people all about what Jesus has done for him. And so, of course, my final question is, which will you be? Which will you be? As I often ask you to do, put yourself into the story and ask yourself, who are you this morning? And ultimately, who do you want to be?